let's now talk about the amazing spread operator. So we can use the spread operator to basically expand an array into all its elements. So basically unpacking all the array elements at 1. So let's say that we have an array, so 7, 8, and 9, and now we want to create a new array based on this array, but with some new elements at the beginning. So how would we do that? Well, with what we already know, we would need to loop over this array, or even worse, do it like manually. For example, like this. Let's call it the bad new array. So if we wanted to add 1 and 2 to the beginning of this array, we would have to write 1, 2, and then each of these elements, right? So that would be R0, R1, and R2. Okay, let's take a look. And now indeed we get a new array with the 3 original elements and then a 1, 2 at the beginning of that array. Okay, and this is actually quite a common operation that we need to do. And so we can now, since ES6, do it in a much better way using the spread operator. So with the spread operator, it's going to work like this. So let's create a new array. So this is the good, let's say, new array. And then again, we use 1, 2, and then we use the spread operator, which is ... to basically expand this array into all of its individual elements. So let's see the result, and then I will explain it a little bit better. So new array, and you see that we get the exact same result here. So what the spread operator does is to basically take all the values out of this R array and then write them individually as if we wrote 7, 8, 9 here manually. All right? So if we wrote it without these 3 dots, then we would have this array, so this R array inside of this one. So just like this. So 1, 2, and then an array of 7, 8, 9. And that's because here we are including this entire array. But with the spread operator, again, it's like taking all the elements out of the array and writing them here manually. And so when we do this, we then get 7, 8, 9 individually here represented in this new array. So what this means is that we can use the spread operator whenever we would otherwise write multiple values separated by commas. And that situation happens whenever we write an array literal like we did up here. So that's the first situation in which it's very useful to expand an array. And the second situation is when we pass arguments into functions. So, for example, let's say that we wanted to actually log the individual elements of this new array here. So if we simply logged the array, then it's of course going to look like this. It's just one value, which is the array. It's just one big value. But if we use the spread operator to expand the new array, then see what happens then. So now it logged the individual elements of the array. So this would be the same as writing 1, 2, 7, 8, 9 individually. So once again, whenever we need the elements of an array individually, then we can use the spread operator. And that is useful when we write an array and when we need to pass multiple elements into a function like we did here. All right, so let's see a bit more useful example. So in this example, we will create an array with one more food item in the main menu array. So that main menu is here at restaurant.mainMenu. And so basically we want to create a new menu here. So const new menu. And then let's say that we want the original array plus one new element. So we can do that by simply expanding the array. So that's restaurant.main menu, and then we can add other stuff. So let's say gnocchi, I think, at least that's how I think it's spelled or pronounced in Italian. And so let's have a look at our new menu. And indeed, it has the 3 original elements plus the gnocchi. And keep in mind that here we are indeed creating a completely new array. All right. We are, of course, not manipulating the restaurant.main menu array. So we are building a new array from scratch. And you can see that here by these square brackets. So this brackets syntax here is simply the way in which we have always been writing new arrays. And so here, again, we are writing a new array, but simply based on expanding this array and then adding another element to it. Okay. Now, you might have noticed that the spread operator is actually a bit similar to destructuring, because it also helps us get elements out of arrays, right? Now, the big difference is that the spread operator takes all the elements from the array, and it also doesn't create new variables. And as a consequence, we can only use it in places where we would otherwise write values separated by commas. And in case you're taking notes, probably what I just said would be very helpful to have as a note. Next, let's learn about 2 important use cases of the spread operator, which is to create shallow copies of arrays and to merge 2 arrays together. So let's say copy array, and so let's simply create a copy of the main menu. So main menu copy, and so let's write a new array, and into that new array we will put all the elements that are currently in the main menu. So at restaurant.main menu, and that's it. So here we just created a shallow copy of this array. So that's a little bit similar to object.assign that we used in the previous section. Okay, but here this syntax is actually a lot easier to use. Now to join 2 arrays together, so join 2 arrays or more, of course, we can use the same technique. And so maybe at this point you can already guess how that would work. And so you can do this actually as a challenge. So pause the video right now and create this variable menu, which will be an array which contains the whole menu. So both the main menu and the starter menu. So take a minute and try it on your own here. All right, so hopefully you managed to do that. And so the secret here, again, is to use the spread operator. So restaurant, and let's start with the starter menu. So that's going to be our first couple of elements in this new array. And then, of course, we can use the spread operator again. And then this time expand the main menu. .main menu. And so now we end up with an array containing all the food items that are both in the starter and the main menu. And again, because here with this spread operator, we took all the elements out of the starter menu and basically wrote them here into this new array, and then the same with the main menu. All right, so I told you that the spread operator works on arrays, but that's not entirely true, because actually the spread operator works on all so-called iterables. Now, what is an iterable? Well, there are different iterables in JavaScript, and we will talk about all of them by the end of the course. But for now, just know that iterables are things like all arrays, strings, maps, or sets, but not objects. So basically, most of the built-in data structures in JavaScript are now iterables, but except objects. So let me actually write that here for you. Iterables are arrays, strings, maps, and sets, but not objects. Now, anyway, since strings are also iterables, that means that we can use the spread operator on a string as well. So let me quickly show that to you. So let's just create a quick string here, Jonas, and then I want to create an array which contains all the individual letters and plus some other elements. So let's call this one letters, and then we create a new array and expand the string here as well. Then here I want an empty string, and then here I want an S. And now let's log it to the console, and then it will make a little bit more sense. All right. And so indeed, here we get this array where each letter of the original string is now an individual element. So just like we expanded, so we unpacked an array, we now did the same thing with a string. Now just keep in mind that we can still only use the spread operator when building an array or when we pass values into a function. So for example, we can also do this. So expand the string here, and so then it is the same thing as writing this. So J, O, and so on and so forth, right? So indeed, here now we get all the individual elements. All right. So for example, what we can do is to use this to build a string using a template literal. So here, this is not going to work. And that's because this is not a place that expects multiple values separated by a comma. So you see unexpected token. All right. So again, multiple values separated by a comma are usually only expected when we pass arguments into a function or when we build a new array. So take note of that, because that is important to understand about the spread operator. Okay, but now enough with building arrays. Let's now actually write our own function that accepts multiple arguments and then use the spread operator to actually pass those arguments. And so that's going to be a very real-life example right there. So let's add here another method now. And so let's say that we want a method to order just pasta, okay? And the pasta always needs to have exactly 3 ingredients. So let's say order pasta, and it's going to be a function. And so now here we need 3 ingredients. So let's just call them inc1, inc2, and inc3. And then just log them to the console or some string. Here is your delicious pasta with, so inc1, inc2, and inc3. So up here we have an error. So this should be number 3. And then let's now call this function. So order pasta. Now what I want to do here is to actually get these ingredients from a prompt window. So remember the prompt function that we can use. And so let's create an array called ingredients. Ingredients. And each element here will be defined by a prompt window. So this here now has nothing to do with the spread operator. It's just a way so that we can actually input the data ourselves. So let's say, and here we need to escape this. So let's make pasta. Ingredient 1. And I think I didn't show you this escaping here before. So here, when we simply write this single quote here to write let's, JavaScript thinks that we are finishing this string here. Okay, and so we could use the double quotes out here, or we can escape using the backslash. Okay, now when we save this, I think that Prettier will actually get rid of this here, but it's still important to know that escaping exists. So basically this masks this single quote here. so that it does not finish the string at this point. So let's save it. And so you see that now the prettier extension actually replaced the single quote with the double quote. And so here we see our prompt already, but let's create two more. So let's say ingredient 2 now, and then another one. So again, here we are simply building an array of the 3 ingredients. Okay, and then we can log it to the console. So just to see A, B, and C. And so indeed, we now get this array ingredients with A, B, and C, which are the 3 strings that we just wrote there. And now, how should we actually call the order pasta function? So restaurant.order pasta. And in the old way, we would now write ingredients 0, ingredients 1, and ingredients 2, right? But since we learned about the spread operator in this lecture, we can now do a lot better. And so instead, we do this. Restaurant.order pasta. And now all we need to do is to expand the elements of the ingredient array. And that will then basically write the 3 elements of the array here separated by commas. So this and this should yield the exact same result. And so let's now test it out with some real data. So let's see, mushrooms, asparagus, and cheese. And so indeed we get now twice, here is your delicious pasta with mushrooms, asparagus, and cheese. And what do you think is the better solution? This one or this one? And especially considering that an array could of course be a lot longer than just 3 elements. So indeed, always go with this more modern ES6 syntax here. It's an amazing addition to the language. And now just to finish this lecture here, since ES 2018, the spread operator actually also works on objects, even though objects are not iterables. So let's write that here. And here let's just write a real world example. And so let's now experiment with this. The first example here was to create a new array based on one initial array, right? And so let's now also create a new restaurant object with all the data from the original one plus some additional data. And so this is actually an amazing way of doing this because it's so much easier than with old JavaScript. So let's call this one new restaurant. And then we can simply spread the old restaurant, and this will then basically copy all the properties of the restaurant into this new object. And then we can add anything that we want. Founder, for example, let's say Giuseppe or Giuseppe, I don't really know how to say it. And of course here the order does not matter as always. So this spread here doesn't even have to be the first one. So let's say we also want the founding year, let's say 1998. Okay, and so with this we created a brand new object. Now we need to get rid of these 3 prompts there because otherwise it's gonna drive us crazy. So let's just take this out and simply log here the new restaurant to the console. And so indeed we get our original object basically plus the founder and plus founded in. Great. And finally, since we were able to do shallow copies of arrays using the spread operator, we can do the same with objects. So instead of using object.assign as we did it in the previous lecture. So let's do that. Restaurant copy. And so all we need to do is an empty object, and then in there expand all the elements of the original object. So the restaurant in this case. And so now if we attempt to change something on the copy dot name, let's call it now Ristorante Roma. And if you're Italian, you're not gonna like how that sounds. But anyway, now as we take a look at both of them, so the name of the copy and the original, now you will see that they are different. So the copy has the name of Ristorante Roma, and the old one has Classico Italiano, which means that indeed we did make a copy of the original restaurant, because otherwise, as we learned by the end of the previous section, changing one object would then also change the other one, right? Cool. So, another long lecture here, but we're making really great progress. And of course, we will use all this in real projects later down the road. But again, I chose to teach you these concepts in a separate way and not inside a big project, because this allows me to show you a lot more different examples, and it also makes the material more referenceable for you in the future. And so that's going to be helpful when you're trying to find what you're looking for after taking this course. Moving on, let's now talk about the REST pattern and also REST parameters. And the REST pattern looks exactly like the spread operator. So it has the same syntax with the 3 dots, but it actually does the opposite of the spread operator. Now that doesn't seem to make much sense, right? But let me explain. So remember that we used the spread operator to build new arrays or to pass multiple values into a function. So those are the 2 use cases of the spread operator. And in both cases, we use the spread operator to expand an array into individual elements. Now the REST pattern uses the exact same syntax, however, to collect multiple elements and condense them into an array. So that's really the opposite of spread. The spread operator is to unpack an array, while REST is to pack elements into an array. And since that sounds really confusing, let's write some code. And let's start by exploring the use case of building arrays. So just to recap, in the last lecture, we used the spread array like this. So we wanted to create a new array based on an existing array. And so we use the spread operator to expand that. So here we are still using the spread syntax. And we know that this is the spread syntax because we are using it on the right-hand side of the assignment operator, so of the equal sign. So let me actually write that here. Spread, because on right side of the assignment operator. However, we can also use it on the left-hand side of the assignment operator together with destructuring. So now we're mixing kind of everything together here, but bear with me here. So let's say that we are destructuring this array. So let me first write the array here, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And so let's say I want to take the first element, store it in variable A, the second element to store in variable B, and now I can here use the REST pattern. So the same syntax, and now let's call this others. And so here it is the REST syntax because it's on the left-hand side of the assignment operator. First write that and then see the result, because on left side of the equal sign. And so now let's log A, B, and the others, whatever that's gonna be. And so 1, 2, and then basically the rest of the elements that we did not select into the A and the B variables. So what is happening here? Well, just like before, the first and the second elements become this first and second variables. But then here comes the REST pattern. And so it's called REST because it will take the rest of the elements, so the remaining elements of the array, and then put them into a new array. And in this case, we call this array others. So as I said in the beginning, the REST pattern basically collects the elements that are unused in the destructuring assignment. So let's see another example here. And this will show you that we can actually use the 3 dots on both sides of the assignment operator. So let's say that we have this array, which will be the entire menu. And so we already know how to build that using the spread operator. So we go to restaurant.mainMenu. So that's dot. So we take all the elements out of that array and put it into a new array. And then into this new array, we also put the starter menu. Okay, so this is going to be an array, a big array with all the entire menu. But now we can actually also use the REST pattern here. And so again, we do that here on the left-hand side while we are doing destructuring. So let's take a look here at the main menu. So let's say that we want to take the pizza and the risotto. Okay, so that's the first and the third. So let's create a variable called pizza. Then we can skip one variable, remember, so leaving a hole there in the destructuring assignment. Then let's call one variable risotto, and then simply put all the other food, well, into an array called other food. And now let's simply log everything here to the console. All right, so we get indeed the string pizza, the string risotto, and then all the rest of the elements that we didn't select previously into their own variables. And note here that the REST syntax collects all the array elements after the last variable. So in this case, here risotto. So it does not include any skipped elements. So it's really just the rest of the elements. And yeah, again, as I said, it does not include any skipped elements. And so for that reason, the REST pattern always must be the last in the destructuring assignment, because otherwise, how will JavaScript know until when it should collect the rest of the array, right? So for example, we could not do this. So the error message is actually very explicit. So the REST element must be the last element. All right. And also for the same reason, there can only ever be one REST in any destructuring assignment. Okay. And now let's do the same in objects, because it also works indeed in objects. So the difference then, of course, is that the remaining elements will be collected into a new object and not into a new array. So let's now work here with our opening hours. And let's say that we want to select only Saturday here. And then the rest should go into a new object, which are the weekdays. So Saturday is weekend, and Friday and Thursday are the weekdays. And so basically we want to create an object only with these two. So only for the weekdays. And now that is easy to do. All we need to do is to basically take out Saturday into its own variable, and then we simply collect the rest into a new object. And this we can call weekdays. Okay? And then here, of course, the object that we are destructuring. Dot opening hours. And now let's take a look at our weekdays here. And indeed, it is exactly what we were expecting. It is an object only containing Friday and Thursday. And again, that's because we already took Saturday into its own variable before. And so this then collected the rest of the properties into its own new object. Great. So now we know how the REST pattern works to collect elements in a destructuring assignment. And actually, let's write that here. So this whole first part is for destructuring. And then the second part will be about functions, basically. So remember that also for the spread operator, the second use case was to pass multiple arguments into a function all at the same time. So that's exactly what we did here in our real example with this ingredients array, right? So we had an array, and then we expanded all of these elements of the array to basically pass these elements then as individual arguments of the function. And so now, as you can guess, the REST operator can basically do the opposite. And so let's now write an example function for that. So I'm going to call it add. And so in a real adding function, we want to take an arbitrary amount of arguments and simply add all of them together, right? So function, and for now, let's just leave it like this. And so let me illustrate how we want to call this function actually. So we want to be able to do, for example, this, 2 and 3. It should give us 5. But then we also might want to be able to do this, 5 and 3 and 7 and 2, for example. So again, any arbitrary amount of arguments should work for this function. So something like this, for example. But of course, we're not going to specify like 7 arguments here, right? So how can we do that? Well, we will use the REST pattern. And in this case, it is actually called REST parameters. So let's use the REST syntax, and then let's call this argument numbers. And here, let's then log this numbers to the console. So this function is going to be called 3 times. And so we are expecting 3 results here. And what we see here is 3 arrays with all the arguments that we passed into the functions. But they are indeed arrays. And so now, once again, as I said in the beginning, the REST syntax is taking multiple numbers or multiple values and then packs them all into one array. So once more, it is doing the opposite of the spread operator. So with the spread operator, we expand. With the REST syntax, we compress. So here it's called REST arguments. Okay? And now we can write some simple logic here to actually add all the numbers together. I believe we already did that. So here is our sum variable that's going to be accumulating. Then let's write a simple for loop. And you could also do this here as a challenge if you wanted. But anyway, I will just do it right away. So we know that numbers is an array, and so we can take the length of that array and run this loop as long as the counter is below the length of the array. And in each iteration, we simply add the current number to the current sum value, basically. So I'm writing this really fast because we already did this before. All right. And so this should be nothing new at this point. And now to finish, we can log this sum to the console to get some results. And indeed, this here is now 5. And so this is at this point a working function which can accept any number of parameters. And hopefully you're not confused yet by this. And now I want to take it even to the next level. So let's create yet another array. Let's just call it X because it's not important. And I will put in numbers 23 and let's say 5 and 7. So now if we wanted to take these values here and call the add function with these 3 values, how would we do that? Well, simple enough. We simply use the spread operator. And that's it. And so this is exactly what we learned in the previous lecture. So we're taking all the numbers of the array and spreading them here. And so this would be the same as writing manually 23, 5, and 7. And so this is a good example of showing you how spread is the opposite of rest. Because after these numbers being spread here, they will then enter this add function here, and then they will immediately be collected into this numbers array by the rest parameters. Okay? So here we unpack the values, and here we pack them back again into an array. And you could actually be wondering why we are not simply writing an add function which takes an array as an argument, and then we don't need all of this. Well, it's way better to do it like this, because then the function can accept both an array, basically by doing this, and simply all the single values, like this. And also it feels a little bit more natural to simply pass as many arguments as we want to add together into the function. So without having to deal with arrays if we don't want to. And so this rest parameters is something that you will see all the time in modern JavaScript code bases. Okay, and now just to finish this, let's actually use rest parameters in our restaurant example here, also to see some edge cases. So let's add yet another method here. And this time the method is going to be about ordering pizza. So order pizza. And now pizzas need to have at least one ingredient, but the other ingredients are optional. And for this, rest parameters are perfect. So let's say main ingredient, and then the other ingredients. And so now this is going to work a little bit like this structuring again, where then this here basically will collect all of the rest of the arguments into an array. So let's see that. So main ingredient, and let's log the other ingredients. Okay, and so now let's order pizza. So restaurant.order pizza. And now here we specify our ingredients. So let's say mushrooms, onion, olives, and spinach. So nice vegetarian pizza right here. And so you see, we can specify as many arguments as we wanted. Let's save this. And you see down here immediately that we get mushrooms, which is this first ingredient here. And then we get an array of all the remaining ingredients that we passed in. And so this, of course, is the result of the rest arguments. So again, the first argument was stored into this main argument here. And then all the remaining arguments that were passed in were simply stored into this array by the rest parameter syntax. Okay. And of course, we could also simply define just one. So let's order now a pizza with only mushrooms. Then the remaining arguments here will simply be put in an empty array because, of course, there are none. And so there's nothing to collect into the array, but we still get an empty array that we can work with if we want. So in that function, we could now create some logic, like to create a string based on all of these ingredients, but I'm not going to go into that right now. But if you want to have some fun, then feel, of course, free to do that by yourself. Anyway, the takeaway from this example is that, once again, the rest parameters serves to collect all of the remaining, basically unused parameters that were not used in this parameter. All right, so let's recap after yet another quite long lecture here. So the spread and the rest syntax both look exactly the same, but they work in opposite ways depending on where they are used. So the spread operator is used where we would otherwise write values separated by a comma. On the other hand, the rest pattern is basically used where we would otherwise write variable names separated by commas. So again, the rest pattern can be used where we would write variable names separated by commas and not values separated by commas. So it's a subtle distinction, but this is how you know when and where to use spread and rest.